Welcome to COVID Unmasked. I am Julia Jordan-Zachery. I want to offer a little bit of a trigger warning. Listener discretion is advised. Some episodes may touch on troubling topics such as self-harm, including cutting, loss, and death. Might be hints of sadness. So I encourage you all to do what you need to do in order to take care of your spirit as you engage with us in Black women's journeys through COVID-19. When Black women show up, we bring our wisdom, resilience, and more importantly, we bring our truth.
She wasn't personified just into one woman. She seemed all too familiar to me, almost as if she was fam.
Grab your tea.
In this episode of COVID Unmasked, we focus on Black mother schooling during COVID-19. The integration of social justice while caring for ourselves will also be central to our conversation. Today, I welcome my guest who contributed a beautiful chapter to the book, Black Women and the Rona. And we will talk a little bit more about the book in another area. But their chapter is titled Black Mother Schooling, Creating a Liberatory Community for Home Education. As is our norm, we allow our guests to introduce themselves before we dive in. So feel free to introduce yourselves.
I am Kendra Jason. I am a mother scholar. I have a 15-year-old daughter, and I am an associate professor of sociology. My primary expertise, or purpose rather, is for the empowerment and betterment of Black people. Thank you for having me, Julie.
My pleasure.
Happen next. I'm Janaka Lewis. I am a professor of English and associate dean of curriculum and student success at UNC Charlotte. I have two children, a 14-year-old son and an 11-year-old daughter, and my work and practice is in Black women's and Black girls' stories, wellness narratives, and freedom and liberatory practices. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dean.
Hi, my name is Kaja Dunn. I am an associate professor at Carnegie Mellon, the first African-American woman at the Purnell School of Drama, partially thanks to these women. And I teach anti-racist and equitable theater practices. I'm also a director and an intimacy coordinator, and I'm the mother of three children, three boys, ages 14, 10, and 7.
Hi, my name is Dace Brown. I am an assistant professor of gerontology, and I am the mother of three children, ages 20, 18, and 17, two girls and a boy. And my research practice is in understanding the motivation to exercise, and I specifically enjoy understanding the motivation to exercise among Black women.
Thank you. Help me out here with that motivation piece, but that's another conversation.
And you do marathons and triathlons and kick butt.
Beautiful. And we do have to honor Dr. Tehia Glass, who is a little bit under the weather. So we send all the healing to her and thank her for contributing to this chapter. So let's dive in. And like I said, we take this conversation where Black women want to go, because this is your story, okay? So let's sip some tea and talk. Can you describe your experience as a Black mother managing your children's education during the pandemic? What is your experience like as a Black mother managing your children's experience during the pandemic?
Kaja wants to go first.
No, Kaja just thought hyper visible and invisible at the same time and trying to stay afloat when I think we're 3 years, 4 years out from when this all started. And I think it broke me in a way that I lost some things, but I got put back together with the help of my sisters in a way that made me tougher because it was literally impossible. It was, I remember having 3 or 4 schools reach out because everybody decided for 2 minutes that racism was an issue and Black women needed to solve it. Every child had an impossible schedule at school, so they were supposed to change Zoom classrooms at 1:02 p.m. and mothers were expected to do that. we were having trouble getting food. I mean, I had packed beforehand. So like, I remember getting like fever medicine out to somebody. I had a girlfriend with lupus who needed a thermometer. And then our departments were falling apart. And so it was just I literally remember going, they will kill us and our children and not care. Right. And then also you couldn't get a passport and there was no truth being told. So it's just this culmination for me of, it felt like a boiling point. And I know for me, having this writing group meet online was one of the few bright spots or like sanity points, because at the very beginning, it literally felt like insanity. And then the invisibility came in how it was being reported about Black women. So I think we talk about this in the chapter, but they spoke about us, like our children falling behind. And then there were like all these white mothers talking about, we gave up homeschooling or we're not, da, da, da. And it was like, we've never done that. And this is not okay. And even in the midst of that chaos, watching how excellent my friends could be and what that did for my family and how we formed as a group, that's where the space was held. But to the media and the outside world, it felt like we were invisible and in this monolith. And it also felt like everybody was like, great, now you all solve everything in the world that we created.
Mm. When my daughter, who was in first grade then, was like, it's 2:00. At 2:00, we go to recess. Let's go outside. It didn't matter what I was doing. She needed to go outside and I needed to go outside. And so it was, I think the chaotic part was trying to pretend like everything should be normal when we are all going through these experiences and our children are experiencing disruptions. So where I tried, and I think we as a group and a village tried to do, was fill in, like, make sure they're feeling whole, make sure they are nurtured, they have what they need. And then, teaching my online class, that can happen, around that. Or, we need to make sure that the center is whole and in the fact that we are too. We can't fix it for everybody when, we're trying to keep things going for those we prioritize, including, ourselves.
Yeah, I want to say that so we have children of different ages. Kaya, Janaka, and Tia had at the time mostly elementary and middle and younger. And Daci, of course, had high schoolers and up. I was like right in the middle. My daughter was like 12, 11 around this time. And what was interesting for me is that I thought I was already always really involved in her education and understood what the teachers were teaching her. And she went to a predominantly Black school and it was a magnet and all of these things. And I was a hands-on parent helping with homework and things. But seeing her get educated in my home by her institution was shocking, eye-opening, and it really made me step up and wake up. And like, you just can't trust what these people say about how they're educating your kid. I could hear her classrooms going on. I could hear how her teacher was interacting with her and her classmates. And this is not to take away from the chaos that the teachers were going through. I'm just talking about the curriculum, right? And so for me, it wasn't about the continuation of, my daughter was a little bit more mature, so she didn't need a whole lot, but it was really about me tapping into her educational experience in a way that I thought that she was quote unquote okay. But then I came to realize that things were very off key. I needed to step in. With my sisters here, they helped me think about some outlets for education and help me think about seeking supplementary education outside of what my child was doing in school. So I think for me, that was a great impact.
So I have to say that without this group, my experience would have been very different. I had just started my position at UNC Charlotte when this happened. And so it was this group that actually brought me into the fold. And that was especially important because I don't even live in Charlotte. So there's that, right? I live in Raleigh. And so, as Kendra said, my children were a little older. I had two that were in high school, and my youngest was in middle school. And so, the things that I had to manage for them wasn't so much about the education for the older two. They were actually doing pretty okay. But the middle schooler, her school had never even had any technology information that they had to work with. And so she had to learn how to use Google for the classroom for the first time. And that was really challenging because I'm in the process of making sure that my Canvas stuff is okay for my students, still making sure that the other two are doing what they're supposed to on Zoom. And they had to learn Zoom. But for the baby, the youngest, I had to go ahead and make sure that she actually understood how she was going to use Google Classroom, how she was going to use Google Sheets, how she was going to write her information. And that, I think, was the most difficult part for me because I felt like the school should have anticipated that the students were going to need help and should have had some type of tutorials or some type of, or just something just to make sure that they understood what they were going to have to do. Because it wasn't like all of a sudden we just had to go online. There were a couple of weeks leading up to this where the school was like, okay, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. And during that time, they could have taken, a step back to say, okay, are our students really prepared to learn like this, and what can we do what can we better do, to prepare them? And they didn't. And so I think that the managing part for that was probably the most difficult part for me. But like as Kaja, Janaka, and Kendra said, like being able to come together and for us to have our own time to just talk about what we were going through was especially important.
Yeah, can I just say, like, the sanity that I mean, I hear it now too because there was such panic that I feel like in some ways there was no time to recover, right? And so you forget, but the fact that all of these things were happening and they were so insane, right? Like I had a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and there was not, it was just like, yeah, now make everything work. And also, how is a 5-year-old and my child was in Mandarin immersion at the time, which I would have never done if I had known I had to homeschool Mandarin. But like, how is that supposed to happen? And you were gaslit all the time, right? Like we were being told not to use masks, and I had an immunocompromised child at home. And to have a group of Black women who also had children, who I knew their priority was to take care of their children, it was the only space I saw myself reflected, right? And it was the only space where I could say, this is happening in my department or this is happening at home. How are you all dealing with this? And then also, like, just because Black women are magic, right? Like there was a continual building up of each other that some of our children, Janik, I know your son said this. My kids have good memories of this time, right? And it's because of this sister circle, and because this is where we went. It was the well we went to sort of refresh and refurbish. And for me, a lot of it was like keeping sanity. It was one of the places that we had. And I think because of that, we were able to feed into our children, right? Like I did camps, summer camps all summer, like extracurricular activities. But I say that because like when you're reading, when you said historical record, Julia, I thought about what is written about us, and it's all struggle, right? Which is true. And it's all, here's the disadvantage. And the big discussion we had at the beginning of this is actually our children are getting a reprieve from the racism of their school systems. And we're able to formulate, like Kendra said, I think every single one of my children had some major educational change after COVID because of what I was hearing. A teacher called my child a mutt in class in front of people, right? And so to have a space where I could then process that and go, please help me solve this, or what do we do? Or there was a teacher parade that I was at with these sisters and some other women in our group. And it was right after George Floyd. And it was a beautiful thing that the teachers tried to do, but they led with a police car, which panicked my 3-year-old. And so it was having a space that I could come to and say, the police car, like I get that they were trying, but the police car, and I didn't have to explain any further. And I cannot emphasize what that did for my ability to show up for my children.
I think an important thing too is that all of us individually are equity experts in our own space in the university. Like actually none of us are like in the same space in the university, which is really interesting. But in our spaces, we are one of the few go-to people, if not the only go-to person when it comes to especially racial equity, but equity issues, right? And so when COVID first hit in March, April, it was just panic and mayhem. So they kind of left us alone in a sense because it really wasn't about race as such as much until the racial uprisings gained momentum going into the summer. Now, mind you, all of us are 9-month employees. So what that means is that we don't work in the summer. That's our time off to do whatever we want to do. But this was also the time that the university upticked and said, we want your help in writing anti-racist justice statements. We want your help in figuring out how to handle microaggressions. We want your help, ABC, XYZ, infinity. And so, this is like the no committee, because essentially we basically all said no, hell no at the same time, right?
When is it going to happen? Between the what and the what?
Yeah.
Get a book and read it and find out and figure it out yourself.
Yeah, and going to a space where, like, individually, we had that mantra. I think individually we had no choice but to say no. We prioritize our children, our families, ourselves, whatever. There was no space to extend for the university in our off time on top of that, right? But it was great to go to a space where you could say, you know what they asked me today? And then somebody said, no, they didn't. I say, yes, they did. And then, we bonded and we like laughed, over that. And of course, we're academics because we did develop like a theory out of that, of course. But, the main thing was that the audacity, right? The audacity of, our employer, to make it plain, the audacity of our employer to try to make it our job and our burden to respond to something that they're responsible for on our off time. Right. And there aren't many spaces that we can go to and say, man, my employer asked for this extra thing from me. And I told them no. And somebody say, hell yeah. Most people proceed with caution and conservatism because they want to, because, for a lot of reasons. And so I think that's a really important part of our advocacy, of our identity, and how we navigate that space in these different realms.
I also think that what we did was our own form of self-care, right? So
talk more about that. Tell us more about that.
So, in thinking about what both Kendra and Kaja have said, having the support of one another and being able to feel justified in saying no to the different requests that we had gave us the opportunity to have a mental health awareness to say, I cannot do this right now because, yes, I'm focusing on my children. And yes, I'm focusing on myself. And I'm also focusing on other family members, right? Whether it's, our spouses or boyfriends or whoever we had in our lives at the time. It was our form of self-care, right? And we needed to do that because of all of the social injustice that was going on at the time. And having to be able to explain what was going on to our children in a safe place, right? In our own homes, in a safe place, and to be able to give our children the Black experience of understanding all of the history that came before everything that happened with George Floyd, it was our opportunity to be able to not only take care of ourselves, but to be able to take care of our children, right? Because our children weren't in white spaces being told something totally different, having things glossed over as if all of these people who were dying, who were being murdered, did not matter. And it did. Black lives do matter. Black lives have always mattered, right? But it wasn't until everything shut down and people had to pay attention to it that we were able to also pay attention to ourselves at the same time. And to be able to be selfish in those moments and to be able to say, no, I need to take care of me. I need to take care of the people that love me. I need to take care of the people that I love. And I need to be supported by the people that I know that are going to support me. And so I sincerely am thankful for COVID-19 and for that time in that space, because I had an opportunity to actually heal myself during that time and to be able to work with my children so they could have time for themselves. And I'm thankful for it. And I got to develop some awesome friendships through it. I mean, just
Okay.
seriously. But it was
So
it was a form of self-care.
I call those COVID blessings, right? And I know, and it's not to diminish the harm related to COVID, the health harm, the social impact harm, right? But in the midst of it, especially for a lot of Black women I've spoken to, we got a moment to pause, right? To step back. And so I hear you all talking about those moments, those space making moments, if I were to give it a term. And so I want to dig in a little bit around that, how you all made space. And so you all created a theory, which is a space making, exercise where you could see yourself reflected back, where you could see your children reflected back, where you could begin to think about the work that you were doing, right? So let's talk a little bit more about that theory and how it gave you all the space necessary. Because, academics, we love to look at data and say, oh, this data is telling us that. But I think your theory did a lot more than what us in the academy do. So let's talk about the theory itself, and then let's talk about what it did, the kind of space it opened up for you all and what you all term as mother schooling. What did it give you? What did it allow for you all?
I think for me, Black mother schooling allowed the opportunity to look back and say we weren't the first Black mothers trying to center and prioritize our children. We could look back, centuries, but, more recently thinking about civil rights and Brown versus Board of Education and how in response to, political legislation, communities decided to close off access. We're going to close off the pool. We're going to close off the schools. We're going to, move out and make our own things. We weren't the first mothers responding to this. What we could do was draw from the strength of the ability to prioritize our children, to say, no matter what is going on in the world, like Dace talked about the safety, we will make sure with everything in our power that you are safe, that you are able to respond. And the educational environments weren't necessarily prioritizing them. I had to draw on Sister Dr. Tehia Glass when my son was in the 4th grade, and he wrote an essay on Sojourner Truth. It was part of an assignment, and he wrote too much because he had a lot to say. And so I had to go and I'm like, okay, what should my response be? Let me pause. And then we responded, we're going to keep all of this. You can decide you're going to stop reading, but we think you should continue. And so Black mother schooling allowed us to say, nah, not today, not during the pandemic, not tomorrow. You are the priority. And we will respond accordingly. But we had 4 mothers doing that work that we could draw from as well.
Janaka says, and then that translates into the self-care portion, right? And so, we don't define self-care as spas and brunches. We like spas and brunches, but we don't define self-care in that way, right? And so we're thinking about it holistically, like being in touch with our mental health in a way that we hadn't had to do it before, really seeing our children in a way that we hadn't been able to see them before. And then centering that was a huge part of the wellness and self-care. But it's not just self-care, it's like community care, right? So that's the mother scholars part, because you're not a mother scholar in isolation. Like it's a part of a community identity, right? And so being able to take on those attributes for yourself, but then get reinforced and it get reflected with sisters who are close to you, but then also knowing there's a broader and historical community that you're also tapped into. I think that's also a part of the wellness and the mental health and the self-care. So it's not just the fact that we are, mothers who work in the institutions and we're scholars and we produce knowledge, but how does that translate in our life and then translate in the community?
Yeah, I think when you talk about the theory, Julia, I literally found myself and was able to show it to my children. So another mother outside of this group who's also Cape Verdean invited me to a film talk. And I'd mentioned something about a great uncle who I knew had fought, but I didn't know anything. And they were like, you need to keep talking to him. And it took me 3 months during COVID of calling every week But then finding out the actual like integral history my family had, that they were revolutionaries, that they're in a newsletter with Nelson Mandela, that they helped found the UN, the Cape Verdean embassy at the UN. It eventually led to me going back to Cape Verde last year, but I was also able, my great uncle's wife sent me all of his documents that are at a library in Brown that I didn't know existed. And I was able to give them to my 10-year-old because it was during this period where I thought my child can name all of the wives of King Henry VIII, and none of his teachers can point to the country that our family, part of where our family is from. They don't even know where it exists. So what am I teaching
Yes.
children?
Yeah.
Right.
Mm.
And this was a way, Kendra, when you're talking about self-care, I think also about like going back and finding out who I am and what strength that had, right? Because until then, this had been a theoretical thing that I had done, but it also became my inheritance and it was my birthright. And, gardening with my children, giving them space to go and find when the demands came saying, pay us, right? Like, we're not going to do this as a service project. Cause I actually did do some summer work, but it was like, but you're going to pay us. And I'm listening to this because I'm also tearing up because everything that we're talking about has been dismantled by the university. And I think thinking about, cause even as people are saying, we say no, I'm like, I remember y'all doing some stuff. Like we said no, but even our saying no still meant we were out. There were things we were outpouring. And every single one of those things has been dismantled by the university. And I think about the cost that every single one of those projects cost us individually and the time it cost us. And I do want to just lift up that it was callously tossed aside when people decided the moment wasn't commodifiable anymore. And that makes me value what we did. I mean, we had a graduation ceremony for our children because my babies were missing kindergarten and fifth grade graduation. And so we ordered diplomas. Our Tehia, Janaka, they put on their robes. We sang the Black National Anthem. Poetry was read. We invited grandparents in. So they had their graduations. I have graduation pictures. I'm going to tear up. I have graduation pictures of my babies. We put out baskets of things and people picked things up because we were like, this is too important. Let's figure out how we do it, right? And when Janaka was talking about the civil rights moment, you think about the mothers where schools were closed, or you think about when people realize the power of Black mothers and they make rules that they can't stay home with their children and they can't go to work. Like this to me fits into that timeline because it was literally like, oh, when we leave people alone, look at what they're doing. Let's find ways to keep them busy. And that connects directly to me to all the ways that Black mothers have been pulled away from their children and they still find ways to feed in. But that was so clearly strong in COVID, this like demand to get back to normal when like, so we're going to sit in a faculty meeting for 2 hours and stare at each other while y'all process racism. I don't need to be there for that.
So I'm looking at our time, and unfortunately, we lost Janica. But we'll keep going in hopes that she can join back in. But I want us to think about one thing kind of sort of maybe post-COVID that we want our communities to know regarding mother schooling, right? Which, as you all said, is this intricate relationship between grounding our children in a kind of social justice education while simultaneously caring for our beings, right? Which I always say is very different from self-care. We're talking about caring very deeply for who we are around our identity, around what matters to us, around how we see a future, right? Because embedded in mother schooling is a vision for a future, which is why I think I love it so much, right? And it's such a Black woman thing to critique the here and now, but say, well, in the future we can get here, right? And let me show y'all how we gonna get here, not in the talk, but in the doing. So I want each of you to kind of sort of think about your one takeaway. What is one thing you would love to give to the world in this, for a lack of a better term, what we're considering post-COVID world?
COVID was beyond tragic. I think the grief and trauma of COVID is something that we need to deal with for years. But even in the language of post-COVID, and people are trying to just move past it, but it still matters for who we are today, right? But out of that tragedy, as with many things, we were born anew, right? We found out these new things about ourselves. We found out these new things about our communities. We were able to tap into some resourcefulness and resilience that didn't know was there. We may have been broken, as Kaja said, and put back together. And I would say just don't lose that, honor that, right? Don't lose that in the rush to get back to quote unquote normal. Just remember what you learned about yourself and what you could do during that point, and then carry that forward. And I think that's the great thing about having a community of folks in this journey with you, because sometimes if you forget, they'll remind you, right? And bring you back to that center, and then give you that efficacy to say, oh yeah, in 2022, I did this. So in 2025, I know I can do that, right? And so I think that would be my takeaway.
To piggyback off of Kendra, I would say my takeaway would be to not just to remember, but to always tell the story. So, Julie, I appreciate you, having us on this podcast to be able to tell the story and for this to be memorialized, so to speak, so that people can hear it. And I think at the same time, it's important for us to also talk to people and to remind our children and to tell a story, because that is how Black history is remembered. It's through our stories. It's through us, telling one another, this is the truth of what has occurred and what occurred, in the past. And so we all have our truths of what we went through during COVID. And I think it's important for us to remember that and to tell the story to our children, and to also have our children to remember that, and for them to be able to then tell their stories to, future generations. And so that's my takeaway.
Thank you. That is beautiful. Thank you. Tell your story.
Yeah, I'm thinking, because when you said your children, Dace, I'm also thinking about my students and how many kids I have in the classroom right now who have books covered because they've outlawed libraries in certain towns and they're becoming detention centers. And so when we're talking about history and stories, this like keeping people busy because they're trying to erase everything that was learned. And I mean, for me, what I learned through this was the importance of writing it down, because that's not my favorite thing to do, right? But because it was documented, there's a place I can go and connect students to. And so my big push since COVID has been, this is cyclical. If you look at what happened to Zora Neale Hurston after the Harlem Renaissance, like our country does this. We have in the 1800s, we have post-Civil War and this like Black Renaissance boom. And every Black Renaissance has a spate of lynchings following, or a spate of laws outlawing race, anything following. And so to start to get my students and my children to think about, this is none of, like we said, in the middle of the pandemic, this is not new. And then this is what happens every time. And the point is to get us back to square one. So when we start again, we have to start at square one. And how do we break that cycle, right? So for me, it's been thinking about, how do I, because nothing has slowed down, make sure that my children are still getting what they need when they're doing American history? What books am I giving to the classroom? I'm about to go into my son's school and do a workshop for the teachers, because they need it. It's more useful to me than baking brownies right now, right? But, and really being present for that and making time for that, and being present for my students and making time so that they are carrying forward, because it's going to happen in another 20, 30 years. And they'll go, oh, somebody told me this was going to happen again. And how do we keep this going?
Thank you. So, we begin to conclude by thinking about the power of carrying forward our stories, telling our stories, going back into the past, and remembering that mother schooling is real. And it's how we as Black women and our children and our communities have survived. So I thank you all for your time, your generous giving of your knowledge, and helping us to always center the stories of Black women. Thank you.
Thank you for engaging in this conversation. I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on all you have heard and to think of your story. For more stories, resources, to contribute, and for updates on the larger Black Women Talk COVID project, I invite you to visit the website blackwomentalkcovid.com. That's blackwomentalkcovid.com. Remember to take care of your spirit. Until we meet again.